The picture that will not leave me is a small open window of glass, the kind a child presses a palm against when she wants to see the night from inside the light. In that reflection, faint as breath, there's a hand behind the glass and a second, older camera staring back from the dark like an unblinking eye. Tell me where you're listening from, and tap subscribe if you think every buried truth deserves daylight. I didn't go looking for ghosts. I went looking for a bargain and something mechanical to fix between jobs. My weeks that August had a gentle pattern: shoot a few portraits, label the negatives, check on my succulents that insisted on dying twice before they lived, and drive the long rectangle of surface streets that thread North Phoenix at 25 miles an hour. The air at 5 in the evening sits around 105 degrees, but after sunset, the heat turns low and steady like a hand on the back that never quite lifts. That's when the folding signs pop up. Estate sale with arrows pointing toward cul-de-sacs built when ranch houses were still new and every porch light matched. I have a habit of walking through strangers' rooms the way you'd walk through a museum after closing. Quiet, respectful nothing in a hurry. You learn a place by its leftovers the way a chair has polished a patch of floor, the outline where a cross used to hang the two coffee cups that never drifted far from each other. That evening, a one-story house near a brown park with a dry fountain had its front door propped open with a bag of river stones. Inside smelled like lemon oil and dust. On a side table, somebody had set a bowl of nickels and rubber bands in a neat little swirl as if order might keep time from sliding. In the back room, where it was cooler, I found a milk crate wedged under a stack of flowered towels. The towels fell like tired clouds when I tugged the crate free. Inside sat a Polaroid land camera, thick body fold-out bellows, the weight of a thing built to last. The strap had flattened into a memory of a shoulder. The film door still latched. A strip of old yellow tape sealed the cartridge with a shaky warning in faded ink. I didn't open it. Not there. An older woman in a volunteer vest sat by the door with a metal cash box on her lap. 5, she said when I held up the camera. I put a 10 in the slot and didn't wait for change. Outside, the sun sagged toward a wash of orange over the White Tank Mountains. The asphalt gave back heat like a low stove. Somewhere, a neighbor's sprinkler sputtered a few seconds and died more habit than irrigation. I set the Polaroid on the passenger seat and drove home with the air conditioning on high and the windows still up, the camera breathing that faint, sweet chemical smell old film has when it's trying to remember light. My place is a converted guest house behind a stucco bungalow, 4 rooms tall, shelves, 1 wobbly ceiling fan, windows that rattle when a dust devil noses across the alley. I laid the camera on the kitchen table next to a chipped mug and my notebook. Normal evening check batteries wipe grime photograph the exterior for my catalog. Ordinary work soothes the mind. The lens wore fingerprints from a life lived by someone careful but not fussy. The shutter clicked, faint and honest. When I lifted the strap, a tiny paper label swung clear, a name penciled in neat block letters, an address I didn't recognize at First Sycamore Street. I sounded out the last name, Langley. Names don't mean a thing until they do. Then they open a door you can't close. My days before that were simple. Early coffee light runs, at the dreamy draw a shower that never quite reached cold until October. Invoices that fit in one folder. Nights were quiet, Edith's old jazz low enough to avoid stirring the neighbor's dog a call with my sister every Thursday. I liked the clean lines of a schedule. I trusted how the city turns its lights on at once, porch lamps firing in a kind of unspoken code from block to block. I slept with the back door locked twice and checked not because I was afraid, but because routines like stitching keep fabric from splitting. Phoenix in late summer hums pool motors, cicadas, evaporative coolers, coughing on rooftop pads, distant planes washing a long breath over the neighborhoods as they line up for Sky Harbor. Every grocery lot has a heat shimmer above the cart pen. Every palm has the same ring of old fronds, halfway up dry as corn husks. And every cul-de-sac, no matter how tired the paint, knows its own rhythms. A father hosing dust off a car at dusk, kids counting cracks from driveway to driveway, a mother with a dish towel over her shoulder, calling one last reminder before bedtime. That's where the Langleys belong in my mind, not as a headline, but as a house that kept regular hours. I hadn't met them, I wasn't born when they were, but I knew families like theirs because we all did. People who borrowed sugar and returned a pie, who waved from behind a screen door, who raked their patch of Bermuda grass the same way every Saturday morning. I could hear the way their evening must have sounded in 1971, ceiling fan ticking a slow circle, radio low dishes with the heavy clink of stoneware, the soft thump of a dog's tail against a cabinet. These are the sounds a street rests on. I poured tea and let the mug sit until it went lukewarm the way I always do. I set the camera on a folded towel and wrote the label details in my notebook. That was the first pinprick in the fabric Sycamore Street tugging at some half-memory I couldn't place. Not a story, just an itch. I told myself I'd look it up after I cleaned the rollers. I'm old enough to know not to trust first impressions. Old enough to know when to give a thing a night on the table before deciding what it means. The old me, the one who loved fixing film machines because they can't lie to you, would have left it sealed for a week. But what you hold and what you know are never the same weight. I set the camera down again and looked out into the little yard where the oleander throws moon-shaped shadows on the stucco. Somewhere, several backyards away, a backyard TV carried a baseball game to people I didn't know. Safe sounds. Unremarkable. Exactly what everyone expects to hear on a Tuesday. The next morning, the world stayed ordinary. I photographed a retired teacher with her granddaughter and a quilt she'd stitched from old marching band uniforms, navy squares and gold braid cut into swallows. I mailed 2 prints to a couple celebrating 40 years and a Ford pickup that still started on the second turn. Midday, I stopped at a drive-thru and ate fries in the shade of a car wash bay, the salty heat sharp on my tongue. It was 101 degrees and dropping. The sky held that pale milky blue that means no monsoon tonight. I went home with the good tired you get when you've kept your promises for the day. I hadn't told anyone about the camera. It felt like a small, private errand I was running on behalf of nobody in particular. I wiped the table, rolled the microfiber across the glass, checked the batteries, new AAs and corroded ones out a simple swap like a fresh start. The Polaroid gave a faint hum. I didn't open the film door, not yet. I turned the camera over and studied the felted back of the strap where the name tag had been tucked years ago. The pencil strokes were steady, not rushed. People wrote like that when things weren't urgent. I like how houses keep the day on their surfaces. A cold spot where a plate sat. A dent where a heel rests on the floor beneath a favorite chair. In the old neighborhoods, you can still see where a mail slot used to be if the homeowner patched it just a rectangle of paint that never matched. That evening, I drove by Sycamore Street to see the lay of the land. It's a simple road, a mile, and change off the freeway where the grid lifts a little to follow a drainage ditch. Some houses got new roofs, some didn't. The sun found every flaw in the stucco and painted it gold for a minute before it went. I parked where I wouldn't bother anyone and walked. The houses breathed the same rhythm, swamp cooler, sputter porch chains creaking a lawn chair left in the sliver of shade behind a mailbox. I nodded at a man pulling trash cans back across gravel, and he nodded back with that neighborly half-smile you give a stranger who has the look of someone visiting memories instead of people. I don't trespass. I don't peer over fences. I keep my hands in my pockets and my eyes on the sidewalk, but I let my ears collect what the street gives. On Sycamore, I tried to place the address on the label. Numbers repeat themselves. Mail routes change. Some of the curbs still carry painted house numbers from a campaign the block must have done together sometime in the late 80s, blue background, tiny white star. The one I paused in front of didn't look remarkable. Sagging shrubs, a chain-link gate with the top rail loose on one side porch light fixture without a bulb. The kind of place that isn't anybody's destination, and therefore becomes no one's worry. A faint smell of dust and warm metal came off the screen door, the exact smell of August in this city since I was a kid. The porch step gave a shallow groan when I shifted my weight. I didn't go closer. I stood there and listened. A long block away, a diesel pickup coughed to life. A dog scratched at a fence post. The little world of Sycamore Street turned over the way small worlds do, softly, evenly, with no sense that anything is about to change. The porch next door had a shoebox of chalk under a chair, the lid half on pink and yellow nubs like little bones in a row. Somewhere inside a house behind me, a phone rang twice and stopped. Back home, I set the camera on the table again. I turned on the desk lamp and tilted the shade until the light found the yellow tape on the cartridge, old adhesive gone stiff. The words wavered where the ink had faded. Not a command so much as a note to self-shaky, maybe written, standing up. I laid my palm over the tape and felt the slight give of old plastic. A person wrote that message for a reason. It wasn't mine to guess at, not yet. It's an odd thing how order teaches you the edges of disorder. You learn the sounds of a street, the weight of your own door in your hand, the way air moves around your kitchen when the swamp cooler kicks on. You know your city's breath. You can tell when it catches. I washed the tea mug and let it dry face down on the towel. I turned off the lamp and left the room in the gentle dark that south-facing windows keep after sundown. Outside, the neighbors switched off one porch light and then another, a little wave of darkness rolling down the block. Mine stayed on 15 minutes longer than usual. Not because I forgot, because I was listening for the phone to ring, and it didn't. Because I was waiting for a pair of headlights to glide across my blinds, the way they do when someone eases to the curb and keys the engine off, and they never came. I didn't sleep well that night. The house held a kind of stillness that doesn't feel earned too heavy for the hour, too aware of its own silence. Somewhere past 2 a.m, the air conditioner cycled off and the soft hum that usually filled my apartment went with it. What remained was the faint tick of the kitchen clock, and the knowledge that the Polaroid camera was still sitting on the table, the yellow tape stretched across its cartridge like a secret daring me to look. I told myself I'd leave it alone until morning, that sleep would restore the kind of judgment every investigator needs. But at dawn, when the sun began pushing its way through the blinds in narrow stripes, I was already in the kitchen, the kettle forgotten on the stove, the camera in my hands. The tape cracked when I peeled it back. The sound was small, but it seemed to echo. Inside, the film cartridge looked intact. No corrosion, no moisture marks, just the dull gray of sealed chemistry that had waited half a century. I replaced the batteries, pressed the shutter, and waited. The first photograph slid out blank. The second one did too. On the third, as the chemical haze began to clear, something started to form shapes, color, depth. I leaned closer. The image was a dining room. 4 place settings. A roast chicken on a platter. The light overhead shaped the shadows in a way I recognized before I could name it. It took me several seconds to realize why my breath had caught. I'd seen that room before. Not in person, but in a black and white police photo tucked away in the digital archives of Phoenix's public records. The Langley house. The one that had gone dark on a Friday night in September 1971. I knew because of the ceiling fan, the pattern on the wallpaper, and the small blue plastic cup lying on its side near the edge of the table. My hand shook as I laid the photo down. The story of that missing family had been an Arizona ghost tale for as long as I could remember. Neighbors at dinner parties still mentioned it like a legend that never grew old. I tried another frame. This one showed a hallway. Yellow walls. Family portraits lined up neatly on the right side. The angle was strange low, as if the photographer had been crouching or moving fast. A final click brought one more image forward. The same room again, but stripped bare chairs, overturned plates gone, and in the open doorway, the faint outline of a child's silhouette facing away from the camera. The shadows bent oddly toward it, not from the ceiling light, but from something outside the frame. I sat back, letting the edges of the prints curl in the warm air. They didn't look staged. They looked like time had decided to develop its own memory. I turned the camera over again and found a paper label pressed under the leather strap, handwritten, Faded Langley, 428 Sycamore Saint. That name and address were all the confirmation I needed to know what I was holding. I opened my laptop, typed the words Langley Family Disappearance, Phoenix, 1971, and watched the search results fill the screen. The old headlines were still there. Family vanishes mid-meal. No signs of struggle. Police stumped by desert mystery. The articles painted the same picture I'd already seen through the lens of those photographs, plates, still full, door left open, nothing stolen. They'd simply disappeared. By mid-morning, I drove to the downtown records office. The lobby smelled of paper and cleaning solvent, the kind that clings to everything. A woman behind the desk, gray hair pulled tight, asked what I was researching. I told her I was a photographer working on a local history project. She looked at me for a long moment before disappearing into the back room. When she returned, she carried a cardboard box with the words Langley E. Disappearance Case, number 71, 9204, printed in fading marker. Inside were microfilm rolls, press clippings, property transfers, a few typed police memos. I loaded one reel into the viewer and began turning the dial. Grainy headlines slid past missing family stuns neighborhood police, no closer to answers. Then I stopped on a page dated September 7, 1971. It included a photograph of the Langley dining room taken by investigators. The resemblance to the image I'd just developed was undeniable. Same table, same light fixture, but in the police version, the corner where that hand had appeared in my photo was cropped out entirely. The accompanying report claimed the film inside the original Polaroid was blank, light exposed, no further analysis requested. Whoever logged that entry had considered it non-evidence. I scrolled to the signature line at the bottom of the page. The officer of record was Detective Vernon Drios. The name meant nothing to me then, but it would soon. Back home, I placed the 3 photographs in archival sleeves and laid them across my desk. Under a magnifying loupe, the details came alive, dust in the air like suspended ash. The reflection of a window in a glass of water, and in the first image, the dining room, something new I hadn't noticed before. Near the edge of the frame, a hand, pale and tense, gripping the corner of the table. It wasn't posed. It looked caught mid-movement, as if someone had been trying to stand up fast. I called an old friend, Dominic Tron, a forensic technician I'd worked with years earlier on a documentary series about cold cases in northern Arizona. He was good at finding names inside forgotten files. "Dom," I said, "I need you to check something off the record. A detective named Vernon Drios, active in the early 70s, Phoenix PD." He paused long enough that I thought the line had dropped. "That's a blast from the past," he said finally. "Why I think he handled evidence from the Langley case. Something doesn't add up." "I'll see what I can find," he said. "Text me what you've got." When the call ended, I stared again at those photos until the light outside shifted from gold to gray. There's a difference between curiosity and intrusion, and I felt myself crossing it inch by inch. But the more I looked, the more I sensed that what was missing from the police file wasn't a mistake, it was deliberate. By the next evening, Dominic called back. His voice carried the edge of someone who's just found something he can't quite explain. "Claire, he said you were right. Vernon Drios signed off on the film analysis in 71. But get this, property records show that in 1981 the Langley house was transferred through a shell trust called Desert Willow Holdings. The trustee's name, R. Drios. Same last name. So the detective ended up owning the house." "Looks like it. The trust dissolved a couple years later. No tax filings, no resale record. It's like the property just disappeared. When I hung up, the sound of my own breathing felt too loud. I turned the photos face down, but even then I could feel them in the room as if the air had thickened around them. Somewhere in that house, someone had taken pictures on the night a family vanished, and the man who dismissed that evidence later took control of their home. 2 days later, I drove to Sycamore Street again. The sky hung low, the heat softening the edges of everything. The Langley property was easy to spot, not because of a number on the curb, but because it looked like no one had claimed it in years. The lawn was mostly dirt framed by weeds tall enough to bend under their own weight. A for sale sign leaned sideways behind the fence, half hidden by vines. I parked a few houses down and walked slow, pretending to scroll through my phone. From the sidewalk, the windows were dark curtains drawn. Still, I felt watched the way you do when you're being measured by silence. Back home that night, I enlarged the second photograph the hallway shot and adjusted the contrast on my computer. The blurred area near the end of the hall resolved just enough to show something unsettling. A figure tall, too slender for proportion, its arms oddly straight at the sides. The face was indistinct, but not from motion blur. It looked smeared almost intentionally. Behind the child silhouette in the final photo, the same shape appeared again, halfway turned toward the camera. I don't scare easily, but I'd be lying if I said my stomach didn't knot. I kept staring at those images until the sound of my refrigerator motor starting made me flinch. I decided to record my thoughts the way I did on documentary shoots, just to have a log. Langley Photographs recovered film I spoke into my handheld recorder. 3 images. Dining room hallway aftermath. Possible presence of additional individual not listed in police report. Evidence suggests camera used the night of disappearance. Proceeding with independent verification. When I stopped the recording, the room felt different, quieter. Yes, but charged as if something had shifted simply by being said aloud. I slid the photos back into their sleeves and placed them in my fireproof box. Then I checked the locks twice before turning off the lights. The following morning, the world outside seemed normal again. Cars passing, children heading to school, the familiar buzz of life resuming its rhythm. But beneath it all, a thought kept circling back. If the man who investigated the Langleys had later bought their house, what had he been trying to keep to himself? That question stayed with me when I stopped for gas, when I answered client emails, even when I tried to lose myself in editing old photographs. The answer felt close, like the weight of a storm before it breaks. I found myself driving past Sycamore Street more often than I meant to, slowing at the corner where the road dips. The house looked the same each time, quiet, patient, a mouth that never fully closes. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the mountains, I pulled to the curb again. The porch light was still missing its bulb, but the curtain in the front window wasn't drawn as tight as before. Through that narrow gap, I saw something move, just a shift in the shadow, maybe a trick of the light. But when I leaned forward, the curtain settled back as if someone had let it fall. I stayed there until the sky turned violet and the streetlights flickered on. Then I started the car and drove home without turning on the radio. My hands smelled faintly of the camera's old plastic, and my mind felt heavier than when I'd left. Later, I wrote one more note in my recorder, voice low enough not to disturb the silence around me. Sycamore Street movement in window. House possibly occupied. Must confirm property status. I clicked it off, sat in the dark for a long while, and listened to the hum of the refrigerator steady itself again. Outside, the night settled over Phoenix, wide and unblinking. I left the kitchen light burning until after midnight. Maybe habit, maybe precaution. Either way, I couldn't bring myself to turn it off, not yet. The night after I saw that curtain move, I barely slept. I kept replaying the angle of that window, the way the fabric had settled back into place, as if guided by a hand, not by air. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the hallway from those Polaroids empty, tilted, the kind of image that doesn't let your mind rest. By morning, I decided I couldn't keep staring at old photographs in the dark. I needed answers from someone who'd lived closer to that story than I ever could. So I went looking for Thomas Bell. His name came up in a comment thread buried deep under an old newspaper blog, one of those community sites that collects people's half-remembered tales of vanished neighbors and unsolved crimes. Lived 3 doors down from the Langleys, one post read. Still around, I think. It took 2 days to track him down. When he finally answered the phone, his voice sounded like a man who'd been waiting for a call he didn't want to get. I told him my name explained I was a photographer working on local history and mentioned the camera. There was a pause long enough that I thought he might hang up. Then he said quietly, "If you're talking about that house, we should meet in public." We met at a diner off Interstate 17, the kind with faded red booths and the smell of burnt coffee baked into the walls. I got there early. The waitress filled my cup twice before a tall, weathered man in an old army jacket stepped through the door and looked straight at me like he already knew who I was. When he sat down, he didn't shake my hand. He just nodded once. "You brought it, didn't you?" he asked. I slid the envelope of photographs across the table. He opened it, spreading the images out between the salt shaker and the sugar caddy. For a moment, neither of us spoke. His thumb rested on the one that showed the child in the doorway. Then he exhaled hard through his nose and said, "That's the night they were taken." He told me that back in 1971 he'd been 10 years old, playing in his backyard the night the Langleys disappeared. His family's fence ran along theirs, and he remembered going out with a flashlight looking for his cat. "I saw a man standing at their sliding door," he said. "I thought it was Mr. Langley, but when he stepped into the porch light, it wasn't. He rubbed the bridge of his nose. He moved wrong. That's what I remember, like someone pretending to walk normal. I asked if he told anyone. He laughed once, sharp and bitter. My dad told me to drop it. Said folks don't vanish, they leave for reasons, and good people mind their own." He sipped his coffee and stared at the photo again. "The cops came the next day. I tried to tell one what I'd seen." He patted me on the head and said I had an imagination. He pushed the photos back to me. "I haven't thought about that night in years," he said. "But seeing these, it's like that house never stopped breathing." I told him about the camera's label about the name Drios appearing both in the original case file and on the later property deed. His eyes narrowed when I said it. "Vernon Drios," he murmured. "He was the lead detective. Used to park his unmarked car in front of that place even after the investigation was closed. Folks said he was obsessed. My dad called him the gravekeeper." He looked at me carefully. "You think he had something to do with it?" "I don't know," I said. "But someone wanted those pictures to stay hidden." We left the diner together, standing for a moment under the pale sky. Thomas pulled a pack of cigarettes from his jacket, but didn't light one. "You're going to that house again, aren't you?" he asked. I didn't answer. He studied my face and nodded like he already knew. "If you do, be careful." That place never gave anything up easy. That evening, I sat in my apartment staring at the photos spread across my table. I could hear the faint buzz of traffic through the thin window glass and the soft tap of the ceiling fan chain against the bulb. Every object in that room felt sharp with awareness, as if the air itself were listening. I turned on my recorder and spoke softly, more to steady myself than to document. "Interview with Thomas Bell," I said. "Eyewitness account confirms presence of unidentified male at Langley residence the night of disappearance. Behavioral details: unnatural movement, deliberate posture. Possible connection to lead detective Vernon Drios. Next step, verify structural layout of Sycamore property, specifically interior walls and crawl spaces." I turned the recorder off and looked at the camera sitting in front of me. Its worn black body reflected a sliver of lamplight, and for a second I could almost imagine what it had seen, hands trembling. flash igniting a silent room, the click that marked the end of one life and the beginning of a mystery that would outlive everyone who touched it. By the next morning, I'd made up my mind. I loaded my gear, flashlight, gloves, recorder, and my own digital camera and drove toward Sycamore Street as the sun began to set. The neighborhood was even quieter than before. A light wind moved through the dead grass, lifting dust across the road. The Langley house stood halfway down the block, its paint flaking its windows dull and unwelcoming. I parked 2 streets over and walked the rest of the way, my shoes crunching over bits of gravel. The side gate wasn't locked. It swung open with a metallic sigh. In the backyard, weeds reached my knees. A rusted swing set leaned against the fence, one chain hanging loose. I stopped by the sliding glass door Thomas had described and felt the faint temperature drop near the frame. When I pressed my hand against the glass, it gave slightly under my touch. Unlocked. Inside, the air was colder than the evening outside. It smelled of old plaster and something faintly metallic. I clicked on my flashlight and swept the beam slowly across the dining room. The wallpaper peeled in long curls and a faint outline on the tile floor showed where the table once stood. Dust coated everything, yet the pattern of footprints leading in from the door was mine alone. I stepped forward, the beam tracing along the hallway toward the mirror I'd seen in the photographs. It was still there, large and oval, the wood frame blackened with age. The glass had clouded over, but I could feel air movement around its edges. I tapped once with my knuckle. Hollow. I set down my bag and pressed along the frame until one corner shifted. With a soft pop, the panel loosened, revealing a dark opening behind the wall. I pulled on my gloves, took a breath, and crawled in. The space was tight, 3 feet high at most, and filled with insulation and old wood beams. My flashlight caught something ahead. A cot, its metal frame rusted, a blanket wadded at the foot. Next to it sat a crate holding a cracked water bottle, a lighter, and a torn comic book. I reached for the crate and froze. On top of it lay another Polaroid photograph face down. When I turned it over, my breath caught. It was Beth Langley. Her face, tear-streaked eyes, swollen hands bound in front of her. She was alive in the photo, illuminated by the same harsh flash I'd seen in the earlier shots. On the back, written in thin ballpoint pen, were the words, "She still cries, but not for long." For a moment, all I could hear was my own pulse. Then came something else, a sound too soft to be wind, too steady to be imagination. Breathing. It was faint deep within the wall, like someone sleeping inches from me. I turned off the flashlight and held still. The sound paused, then shifted closer. I crawled backward fast, scraping my elbows against the wood, and tumbled out into the hallway. I shoved the panel back into place, pressing until it clicked shut. Behind it, a single scratch traced across the wood. Once. Twice. Then silence. I don't remember running out of the house, only the cold rush of air when I hit the yard and the slam of the gate behind me. I didn't stop until I was back in my car, door locked, hands shaking on the steering wheel. My lungs felt raw, like I'd swallowed the dust of that place. I sat there until my breathing leveled out enough to start the engine. Back home, I recorded again. Recovered photograph, I said quietly. Subject, Beth Langley, post-disappearance. Evidence of restraint. Handwriting suggests captivity. Crawl space inhabited recently, presence confirmed by auditory contact. No visual ID. I stopped the recorder and stared at the photo lying on the desk. The girl's expression was so raw it felt almost alive. Fear and exhaustion layered into one unbroken look of pleading. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every sound, the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator tugged my nerves taut. When morning came, the desert light felt harsh, merciless. I called Thomas, told him what I'd found, and before I could finish the sentence about hearing someone inside, he said, "I'll meet you at 10, and you're not going back there alone." He showed up right on time, carrying a crowbar wrapped in a towel. We drove in silence. By the time we reached Sycamore Street, the air was still heavy with the kind of heat that makes everything sound farther away. We entered through the same window, moving slow. Inside, the air felt different, fresher, almost disturbed. The dust along the floor near the mirror had been brushed aside. Thomas pried open the panel again, and we crawled in together. My flashlight beam caught the cot first, then something else behind it, boxes stacked in a rough wall. We pulled one down. Inside were sealed film cartridges, dozens of them, each labeled in neat handwriting. September 1971. Hallway. October 1971. Girl in Blue. 1974. Broken Doll. 1979. Watcher and Mirror. Each title felt like a wound. Thomas opened another box. Inside were developed Polaroids curled from age. There were more pictures of the Langley family, Clara, Edward, the children all alive but hollow-eyed standing in front of that same dining room table months after their official disappearance. Another photo showed Beth sitting beside an older woman I didn't recognize. Both wore matching blue dresses. Thomas's hand trembled as he turned one over. On the back was a date, April 1972. Jesus, he whispered. They were still here. I didn't speak. I just kept flipping through image after image until the next one stopped me cold. It was a photo of a small room lined with shelves, each holding a different camera pointed toward a single chair. A makeshift studio. Someone had documented everything. Before we could open another box, Thomas froze. "Do you smell that?" he said. The air carried a faint sour odor, something between rust and decay. He raised his flashlight and pointed toward the far wall. A small vent near the floor was open, and behind it a dull red light blinked once, then again. "Battery indicator," he said. "That's a live camera." I looked closer and felt my stomach drop. The light wasn't coming from inside the vent, it was reflecting. A lens was pointed directly at us. Someone had been watching from the other side. We backed out fast, leaving the boxes where they were, and climbed through the window into the yard. My hands were shaking again as I drove us away from Sycamore Street. Neither of us spoke until we were halfway across town. When I finally broke the silence, my voice sounded foreign. "Whoever's behind this isn't gone." Thomas nodded, staring out the windshield. "No," he said quietly. "He's still in that house one way or another." That night I set the new photographs on my desk beside the original 3. The images seemed to breathe in the dim light, each one a fragment of a story too large to hold. I thought about the breathing in the wall, about the boxes, labeled like chapters of a book someone had never finished writing. I didn't turn off the light when I went to bed. And before I closed my eyes, I left the recorder running, just in case the night had more to say. I left the recorder running that night more out of instinct than reason. The soft red light blinked on my desk like a heartbeat, steady patient waiting for something to happen. I lay awake listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant bark of a dog somewhere down the street. When the desert finally quiets, it does so completely. No crickets, no rustle, just the low electricity of a city pretending to sleep. Around 2 a.m, a sound came through the open window, a short, clean click. I sat up, heart hammering. It wasn't the kind of noise that belongs to houses. It was mechanical, familiar. I got out of bed and turned off the recorder. For a long moment, I stood there in the dark, certain I'd just heard the Polaroid camera's shutter. By dawn, I convinced myself it had to be something else. Stress, exhaustion, imagination reaching for shape in the dark. But when I walked into the kitchen, the camera was sitting a few inches off the towel where I'd left it. I stared at it long enough to feel the small hair on my arms lift. The cartridge still held 2 undeveloped sheets. I pressed the release. One photograph slid out blank, but when I tried the second, an image began to form, a window shot from outside, pale curtains glowing from within. My own window. My house. That's when I called the police. Not 911, but the non-emergency line. I told them someone had been on my property, that I'd found evidence of trespassing. An officer came within the hour, a young man with tired eyes who glanced around my small kitchen and made a note on his tablet. "Could be kids," he said. "Old equipment sometimes fires on its own." I could tell he didn't believe I'd been followed. He handed me a card and left. I watched his cruiser pull away until the heat shimmer swallowed it at the end of the street. By noon, I was on the phone with Thomas. I told him about the new photograph. He didn't try to explain it away. "We stirred something up," he said. "You know that." I heard him light a cigarette. "I still have friends at the precinct. I'll see if anyone remembers Drios, or that trust he used to buy the house." I didn't want to admit it, but part of me hoped this was all connected to him, that the story had an ending bound by human hands, not something worse. That night I locked every door, pulled the shades, and moved the Polaroid into a locked cabinet. Still, I couldn't shake the image of that photo, my own window, seen through someone else's eye. The next morning, Thomas called back. "You're not going to like this," he said. I checked records. Vernon Drios's license was revoked in 1982. He left the force after a disciplinary hearing, unlawful evidence handling in a homicide case. Disappeared not long after. Where I asked, nobody knows. But his only listed property was 428 Sycamore. Guess where his mail was still being forwarded as of last year? The silence on the line was answer enough. We decided to take what we'd found to the county detectives. But to do that, we needed proof that the crawl space in those boxes existed beyond our word. Thomas wanted to go back once more, photograph everything properly, bag a few samples. I told him it was reckless, but I went anyway. It was late afternoon when we reached Sycamore Street again, sun just folding into the trees, shadows stretching long across the cracked sidewalk. We parked 2 blocks down and walked the rest of the way. The air smelled dry, metallic, as if a storm was building somewhere far off but couldn't find its way here. Inside the house, the temperature dropped 10 degrees. We moved carefully, flashlights sweeping the walls. Dust motes floated like tiny galaxies. The mirror panel was already ajar. My stomach turned when I saw the faint drag marks on the floor, like someone had pushed it open recently. The crawl space looked darker than before, the smell sharper damp. Thomas went first, flashlight in one hand, crowbar in the other. I followed, recorder clipped to my collar lens cap off on my camera. The boxes were still there, but the order had changed. Some had been pulled forward, their lids torn. On the far side of the space, a patch of wall looked newly disturbed, drywall, cracked plaster flakes scattered. Thomas knelt and ran his fingers along the break. "Something's behind here," he whispered. He wedged the crowbar in and pushed. The panel gave way with a groan. Behind it was a narrow wooden door, no bigger than a crawl hatch, padlocked shut. I aimed my flashlight at the lock. It wasn't old. Polished steel, hardly rusted. "Someone's been maintaining this," I said. Thomas pried at it until the hinge split, the metal whining under pressure. The door swung inward, releasing a breath of air so stale it burned my throat. The smell was unmistakable rot and chemicals, the kind that sinks into fabric. The space beyond was larger than the rest of the crawl area. My light caught metal shelving, stacked jars, and another cot. Against the far wall stood a tall cabinet covered by a sheet. Thomas hesitated. "You ready?" he asked. I nodded. He pulled the sheet down. Inside, a row of Polaroids had been pinned to corkboard, hundreds of them, edge to edge, covering every inch. The first few were of the Langleys, each photo dated by hand. But as the years moved forward, the faces changed. Different women, different children. Each labeled with a first name, Lori Ann, Becky, Jess. Each posed the same way, standing beside a window, looking just past the camera. In the center of the board hung a recent photo color, still sharp. It showed a young woman holding a small girl. The child's eyes were strikingly familiar, large blue, set wide apart. My chest tightened. It was Beth. Older, worn, but unmistakably her. Thomas stepped closer, tracing the writing beneath it. "Beth and Lily," he read aloud. "The date was 2 years ago." My knees went weak. She had a daughter, I said quietly. At the bottom of the cabinet sat a stack of boxes labeled the same way as before. One had been pried open. Inside were journals, spiral notebooks filled edge to edge with cramped handwriting. I pulled one free and flipped through. Every page documented dates, names, and what seemed like lessons or instructions. Don't let them cry too long. Always keep one light on. Never tell them what's outside. The further I read, the worse it became. One entry dated 1993 mentioned something that made the room tilt around me. Found new caretaker. The house keeps what it loves. I looked up. Thomas, I said. He wasn't alone. Before he could answer, a sound came from above. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving across the floorboards directly overhead. We froze. The house had been empty for years. Then came another sound, faint, almost gentle, a child humming. The melody carried through the air vents like a thread. Thomas's face went pale. "We need to go," he whispered. We crawled out fast, the light catching in dust clouds that made everything shimmer. The humming stopped. I glanced toward the hall mirror. For a heartbeat, I thought I saw movement in the glass, a shape slipping out of view. Then the floor above creaked, and something heavy hit the ground. We bolted through the kitchen and into the yard, lungs burning, hearts pounding in sync with our steps. Once we were back in the car, neither of us spoke. Thomas kept his eyes on the rearview mirror until the house disappeared behind us. When we finally reached the main road, he pulled over and rested his forehead on the steering wheel. "Whatever's in there," he said, "it's not done." I didn't disagree. The photographs, the handwriting, the voices we heard, they pointed to a chain that stretched across decades. Someone, maybe more than one, had carried on what started in that house long after the Langleys vanished. Later that night, I took everything we'd found, the new photos, the journal pages, the recordings, and laid them across my kitchen table. My hands smelled like rust and old wood. I opened one of the journals again and studied a passage written near the back. "When the world forgets, the house remembers." She's learning to watch. I didn't know who wrote it. Drios or whoever came after him, but I knew what it meant. There were others. Just before midnight, I turned on my recorder one more time. My voice shook when I spoke. Evidence collected confirms multiple victims over 50 years, all documented through photography. Recent entries suggest continuation of activity beyond original perpetrator. One living child potentially present. Must alert authorities. I stopped the recording, staring at the blinking light until it went still. Outside wind lifted through the palms, rattling them against the power lines. In the distance, thunder flickered, though no rain came. I sat there in the half-dark, listening, waiting for silence to settle again. But it never really did. There was always a faint hum under it, like a breath caught in the walls. The next morning, I contacted Detective Ramos at the County Cold Case Unit. I handed over the photos and the journals. She promised to send a team to Sycamore Street within the day. I gave my statement, signed every page they placed in front of me. By the time I left the precinct, the heat had risen and the air shimmered above the pavement. For the first time in weeks, I thought maybe it would end. But that night when I came home, there was a package waiting on my doorstep. No return label, no postage, just my name written in neat, blocky letters. Inside was a single Polaroid, freshly developed. It showed the inside of a police cruiser parked outside the Sycamore house, 2 officers framed in the windshield. And at the bottom, written in faint blue ink, "The house keeps what it loves." I stood there on my porch, the night air dry as paper, and knew this story wasn't finished. Not yet. The morning after that package arrived, I drove straight to the precinct. I didn't call first, didn't eat, didn't even make coffee. The desert air was still cool, and the light had that pale gray color before sunrise, the kind that makes every shadow look like a bruise. I kept the photograph in a folder on the passenger seat, trying not to glance at it, but it felt alive beside me. the kind of object that hums in your peripheral vision, reminding you that truth has teeth. When I handed it to Detective Ramos, she studied it for a long time without speaking. The Polaroid showed two of her own officers sitting in their cruiser, unaware they were being photographed. Her thumb hovered over the handwritten words at the bottom. "The house keeps what it loves." That changed everything. Within hours, the department sealed off 428 Sycamore Street. For the first time in 52 years, the property was treated as an active crime scene. The tape went up, the press got wind, and by noon, there were news vans parked 3 blocks down, antennas pointed toward a house that had been invisible for half a century. I wasn't allowed near it, and honestly, I didn't want to be. Some stories need distance to finish telling themselves. 2 days later, Ramos called me back to the station. I still remember how she closed her office door before she spoke. They'd found something inside beneath the floor of that hidden room sealed under planks and plastic sheeting. Human remains. More than one set. Most were too decomposed to identify immediately, but dental records later confirmed what we already knew. Edward Clara Sammy and Bethany Langley. All 4 had been buried within the same walls they'd once called home. But there was more. In one corner of the same crawl space inside a rusted trunk, they found a 5th-body adult female estimated to have died less than 2 years earlier. DNA confirmed her as Bethany Langley grown. She had lived somehow long after her family was declared dead. And with her they found a second trunk, smaller, containing clothes drawings, and the remains of a child roughly 6 years old. It was the same girl from that last photograph. Lily, the daughter she'd raised in captivity. There are details I'll never repeat out loud. What was written in those journals? What they uncovered in that house, it stretched beyond cruelty into something ritualized, something rehearsed by different hands across generations. The records showed that after Detective Drios disappeared in the 80s, the property passed quietly between shell owners, each one assuming the lease for a few years before vanishing. Each new tenant seemed to follow the same pattern: no mail, no neighbors' lights that flickered on only at night. The FBI's behavioral unit called it a caretaker pattern, a kind of twisted apprenticeship. Whoever started it had built a system that kept the house alive long after his own death. In the basement, investigators found a film developing setup and several sealed boxes containing the same kind of Polaroid cartridges I'd uncovered. Some were dated as recently as 2021. The contents matched what we'd already seen: photographs cataloging people, mostly women and children, staged as if posing for family portraits. Only one roll was unfinished, still drying on the line. The final frame was of me standing outside the chain-link fence the night Thomas and I first went back. That image broke something in me. It confirmed what I'd felt all along, that whoever was running this operation had been steps ahead watching. And if they'd taken that picture, it meant they'd been close enough to touch. Thomas gave his full statement, though he avoided cameras and press. He told me later that he still dreamed of that house, the smell of it, the sound of breathing in the walls. He moved north a few months after the case closed. I understood why. I stayed long enough to finish an audio documentary with the department's permission, using portions of my own recordings as evidence. I wanted to give the Langleys their story back to replace the silence that had stolen them. But when the file finally aired, the house in the photograph, I couldn't bring myself to listen to it. Detective Ramos received commendation for closing the oldest open missing persons file in state history. She retired shortly after. The house was condemned, its structure deemed unsafe for excavation. Officially, it was to be demolished and replaced with a memorial garden maintained by the city. But in the summer heat, delays piled up. Permits lapsed. The demolition date was pushed back again and again until the project was quietly dropped. The property still stands, boarded and fenced, weeds climbing the siding like veins. Some nights, neighbors say they see a light flicker behind the upstairs window, faint bluish like a flash bulb caught mid-breath. The department chalks it up to trespassers, teenagers chasing ghosts. But people in that neighborhood don't linger. They cross the street, lower their voices. The air on Sycamore Street still feels wrong, too. Still like the sound has been scooped out of it. I think about that often, about how a place can hold on to memory the way a body does, how walls can absorb every sound, every breath until it becomes something living on its own. The Langleys' story was never just about murder. It was about the way indifference multiplies, the way one person's cruelty can find new caretakers in silence. When the case file was officially closed, Ramos called me one last time. She thanked me for coming forward, for holding on when no one else would. But her voice carried something else, fatigue, maybe guilt. "You should know," she said, "we never recovered whoever sent you that last photograph. The fingerprints didn't match any record. The paper stock is from a batch discontinued in 2004. Whoever it was, they wanted us to see what was left." Then they vanished. I asked her if she thought it was someone still keeping the ritual alive. She sighed. "Or ending it," she said. "Sometimes people don't confess they curate their own legacy." That line stayed with me. For weeks afterward, I couldn't look at a camera without feeling watched. I boxed up my equipment, stored it in the closet, and started teaching part-time community photography for seniors, small classes that had nothing to do with mystery or death. But even then, I caught myself checking reflections too long, half expecting another flash behind me. In time, the fear softened into something quieter. Respect, maybe, for the weight of what truth costs. The Langleys didn't vanish because of one man's madness. They vanished because no one looked closely enough when it mattered, because people trust that horror wears a face. But sometimes it wears a badge or a neighbor's smile, or the silence of a street that doesn't want to remember. It's been a year since the last evidence was cataloged. The remains were reinterred in a small cemetery just outside Phoenix. No ceremony, no cameras, just 4 small markers lined in a row and one separate stone beneath a young tree that reads simply, "Beth and Lily together at last." I visited once. The groundskeeper didn't recognize me, which was a kind of mercy. The air was warm, dry, filled with the hum of insects. I laid one of my old film negatives on the headstone, a blank frame. I figured they'd had enough pictures taken of them in life. They deserved one that held nothing at all. When people ask what I learned from all this, I never give them an easy answer. There isn't one. I tell them that truth doesn't free you. It changes you. Sometimes it leaves you standing at the edge of a story you'll never fully understand, holding the pieces of other people's lives and trying not to drop them. But there's a kind of grace in that, too, in bearing witness and refusing to let silence write the ending. I still live in the same house. I keep the old Polaroid locked away in a box on the highest shelf of my closet. I haven't touched it since that final day, but I also haven't thrown it out. I can't. Maybe that's my own superstition, or maybe it's respect. Some things once seen refuse to be unremembered. When I walk in the evenings, I take the long route away from Sycamore Street, away from that neighborhood that learned the hard way that memory has a pulse. But sometimes in the right light, when the air turns gold and the shadows stretch long, I catch the reflection of my own window from across the street. And for just a second, I think I see a small hand pressed against the glass, watching, waiting like it did all those years ago. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark.